The rotor wash of the MH-60 Black Hawk whipped the desert sand into a blinding frenzy. But the real storm was inside the cabin. At the edge of the open door, staring down into the black abyss of a simulated combat zone, stood Titan. He was an 80-pound, pitch-black German shepherd, engineered for war, yet he was trembling. He was failing. Again, behind him, command was ready to pull the plug, ready to stamp washout on a $100,000 military asset. But Chief Petty Officer Thomas Weaver knelt in the deafening roar, ignoring the screaming instructors. He pulled Titan close, leaned into the dog's pinned ears, and whispered a single, impossible word. And the monster awoke. The Naval Amphibious Base Coronado is not a place that tolerates weakness. It is a forge where human and canine steel is tested against the anvil of impossible standards. The air always smells faintly of salt, aviation, fuel, and sweat. In the elite world of naval special warfare, the multi-purpose canines, MPCs, are treated with the exact same reverence and subjected to the exact same ruthless scrutiny as the SEALs who handle them. Titan was, by all biological metrics, a masterpiece, sourced from a premier breeder in the Czech Republic. The black German shepherd possessed a bite force that could shatter a femur and a nose sensitive enough to detect explosive residue, buried 3 feet under compacted dirt. He had the broad chest of a champion and the cold amber eyes of an apex predator. When he ran the obstacle course alone, he was poetry in motion, clearing 6-foot walls with effortless grace. But put Titan in a tactical scenario, and the poetry collapsed into a tragedy. It was an overcast Tuesday morning when Chief Petty Officer Thomas Weaver first laid eyes on the problem child. Weaver, a 14-year veteran of the teams with deployments across the Middle East and the Horn of Africa, had recently transitioned to the K-9 training cadre after a shrapnel injury to his knee grounded him from kinetic strike operations. Weaver knew dogs. He understood the silent language of muscle twitches, ear pivots, and tail carriage better than he understood most human conversations. Standing on the catwalk above the kill house, a labyrinth of plywood rooms used for close-quarters combat, CQC simulations, Weaver watched the drill unfold. Below, a fire team stacked up on a breaching door. Handing Titan was a young, squared-away petty officer named Miller. The scenario was a hostage rescue, with simulated enemy combatants and active IEDs. "Breaching! Breaching!" Miller shouted. The explosive charge blew the hinges off the door, with a concussive shockwave that rattled the catwalk beneath Weaver's boots. Smoke flooded the corridor. Flashbangs detonated with blinding white intensity. It was controlled chaos, the exact environment these dogs were bred to thrive in. A properly trained MPC would push through the smoke, locate the threat, and neutralize the hostile combatant before the SEALs even cleared the threshold. Titan didn't push. As the smoke billowed, Weaver watched the massive German shepherd freeze. The dog's hind legs splayed out. His tail, usually held high in confident authority, tucked sharply between his legs. When Miller gave the command to apprehend, "Hit," Titan backed away, pressing his flank against the plywood wall, emitting a low, pathetic whine that was barely audible over the simulated gunfire. "Push! Titan! Hit!" Miller screamed, his frustration evident, yanking on the tactical lead. Titan dropped to his belly, completely shutting down. He was a paralyzed target in the middle of a fatal funnel. Had this been a real raid in a hostile compound, both the dog and his handler would have been shredded by enemy fire. "End X! End X!" shouted Master Chief Sullivan, the lead evaluator, his voice dripping with disgust as he stepped out from an observation room. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at Miller. "Get that animal off my floor, Miller. We're done." Down in the kill house, Miller angrily unclipped Titan's lead, muttering curses under his breath. The dog didn't fight back. He just hung his head, looking like a beaten rescue pup, rather than a specialized weapon of war. Weaver descended the metal stairs, his bad knee throbbing in time with his pulse. He met Sullivan outside the debriefing room. "He's a washout, Tom," Sullivan said, rubbing his temples before Weaver could even ask. "That's his 4th catastrophic failure in a hot simulation. The brass wants him rehomed to a civilian police department. Or worse. He's gun-shy. He's noise-phobic. He's a dud. Weaver looked through the chain-link fence toward the holding pens. Titan was sitting in the corner of his concrete run, staring blankly at the wall. There was no pacing, no barking, no anxiety, just a profound, heavy emptiness. He wasn't always a dud, Sully, Weaver said quietly. I saw his early selection tapes. He scored higher in prey drive and environmental stability than any dog in his cohort. Something broke him. I don't care what he used to be, Sullivan snapped. I care what he is right now. And right now, he's a liability. We have a deployment cycle spinning up in 8 weeks. I need operators, not rehabilitation projects. The paperwork for his discharge is already on the commander's desk. Give him to me, Weaver said. Sullivan stopped, turning to look at Weaver as if the man had just spoken in tongues. You're a senior instructor, Tom, not a miracle worker. The dog is psychologically shattered. 72 hours, Weaver bargained, his jaw setting into a stubborn line. Give me his file. Give me 72 hours of absolute autonomy, and keep him off the official roster. If I can't find the missing gear in his head by Friday, I'll sign the discharge papers myself. Sullivan stared at Weaver for a long, hard moment. He respected Weaver. Everyone in the teams did. Weaver had pulled 3 men out of a burning striker in Fallujah while taking enemy fire. If there was a man who understood broken things, it was him. 72 hours, Weaver. Then the dog is gone. And if he bites you during your little experiment, it's your own damn fault. The file on Titan was exceptionally thick, heavily redacted, and deeply troubling. Sitting in his cramped office late that night, surrounded by the smell of old coffee and gun oil, Weaver flipped through the pages. The dog's official service record was a puzzle with the most important pieces deliberately blacked out by the Department of Defense. Titan hadn't just come from basic selection. He had already been deployed. Weaver traced his finger over the heavy black marker lines. 2 years ago, Titan had been attached to a highly classified Tier 1 element operating in the Helmand province of Afghanistan. The mission details were entirely scrubbed, but the casualty report wasn't. The team had been ambushed. 3 operators wounded. 1 Kia. The KIA was Titan's original handler. Petty Officer First Class. James Jimmy Vance. Wait. Weaver mentally corrected himself, glancing at the unredacted line. Petty Officer First Class. David McNamara. Weaver's heart did a slow, painful roll in his chest. He had known Mac. Not well, but well enough to share a few beers at the Coronado McPee's Irish pub. Mac had been a quiet guy, a tactical genius from Montana who grew up training hunting dogs. He was known for being unorthodox, ignoring standard military manuals in favor of old-world, instinctual training methods. Mac had been killed by a secondary IED while clearing a compound. Titan had been 10 feet away when the blast went off. According to the veterinary files, Titan suffered a ruptured tympanic membrane, a blown eardrum, and a minor concussion. His physical wounds healed in 2 months. His psychological wounds, however, had festered. After Mac's death, Titan was bounced between 3 different handlers. Every single one reported the same thing. Dog is unresponsive in kinetic environments, refuses to bite, exhibits extreme fear responses under fire. You're not gun-shy, Weaver whispered to the empty room, looking at a glossy photograph of a younger Titan sitting proudly next to a smiling McNamara. You're grieving, and you're confused. The next morning, Weaver didn't take Titan to the kill house. He didn't put him in a tactical harness, and he didn't bring a weapon. Instead, he clipped a standard leather leash to the dog's flat collar and walked him down to the Pacific Ocean. The beach at Coronado was empty at 0500, save for the crashing waves and the low-hanging fog. Titan walked perfectly at Weaver's left heel. His obedience was flawless. When Weaver stopped, Titan sat. When Weaver walked, Titan walked. But he operated like a machine unplugged from its power source. There was no joy, no spark, no scanning of the horizon. Weaver unclipped the leash. Break, he said. the standard release command. Titan didn't move. He sat in the wet sand, staring straight ahead. A seagull landed 5 feet away, squawking loudly. A normal shepherd would have lunged, or at least tracked the bird with its ears. Titan didn't even blink. "All right, buddy. Let's see what Mac taught you," Weaver said softly. For the next 2 days, Weaver completely isolated Titan from the base's chaos. He moved into a cot in the kennels, sleeping near the dog's run. He fed Titan by hand, piece by piece, forcing the dog to maintain eye contact for every morsel of kibble. He spoke to him not in the sharp, staccato barks of a military handler, but in a low, conversational tone. He ran through the standard repertoire of German and Dutch commands used by military working dogs. Sitz, Sit, Titansat, Platz, down. Titan lay down. Higher. Here, Titan recalled. It was textbook, but the moment Weaver introduced stress, a loud clap of his hands, a sudden sprint, the popping of a starter pistol from 50 yards away, Titan reverted to the broken, cowering animal from the kill house. By Thursday evening, Weaver was running out of time, and he knew it. He sat on the floor of the training yard, his back against a tire, watching Titan chew lazily on a rubber Kong. The deadline was tomorrow morning. Master Chief Sullivan had scheduled a final, definitive evaluation, a live fire simulation in the C-17 aircraft mock-up. If Titan froze in the bird, he was out. Dr. Sarah Jenkins, the base's chief veterinary behaviorist, walked up to the chain-link fence, holding a clipboard. "You look as tired as the dog, Tom," she noted, her voice sympathetic but professional. "I'm missing something, Doc," Weaver sighed, tossing a pebble at his own boots. "He's not traumatized by the noise. I watched him sleep through a C-130 taking off not 200 yards from the kennels yesterday. His ears didn't even twitch. It's not the environment." Dr. Jenkins unlocked the gate and stepped in, crouching down. Titan looked at her, then looked away. Entirely indifferent. "PTSD in canines is incredibly complex," she explained, adjusting her glasses. "When McNamara died, the associative link between the handler's command and the action was shattered by the trauma of the IED. Every time a new handler yells hit or bite in a chaotic environment, Titan isn't hearing a command. He's experiencing a flashback to the moment his world exploded. So how do we rewire the association? Normally, months of counter-conditioning. A slow, agonizing process of reintroducing stress alongside positive reinforcement, Jenkins said. But you don't have months. You have 12 hours. There has to be a back door, Weaver muttered, standing up and pacing. Mac was from Montana. He didn't train out of a military manual. If he knew he was going into heavy fire, he wouldn't use standard commands. Standard commands get lost in the noise of a firefight. He would have built a secondary trigger, a fail-safe. Jenkins frowned. A fail-safe? Like what? A hand signal? No. Titan shuts his eyes when he panics. Hand signals are useless, Weaver said, his mind racing, piecing together the fragmented puzzle of David McNamara. Mac trained hunting dogs, pointing dogs, bird flushers. They work hundreds of yards away in the brush. Sometimes you can't see them. Sometimes they can't hear you clearly. Weaver stopped pacing. He looked at Titan. Doc, when Titan was recovered after the blast, what was his physical state? Before they sedated him, Jenkins flipped through the pages on her clipboard, her eyes scanning the medical intake notes from Bagram Airfield. He was highly agitated. Lacerations, the blown eardrum. Notes say he was fiercely guarding McNamara's body. It took 3 medics to pull him off. Guarding him, Weaver repeated. He didn't run away from the blast. He stayed on target. Weaver sprinted to his office, leaving Jenkins standing bewildered in the yard. He tore through the redacted file again, looking for anything, any small detail about McNamara's personal effects, his history, his off-duty hobbies. He found a digitized copy of Mac's personal journal that had been swept up in the post-Kaya inventory. Most of it was mundane complaints about the chow, letters drafted to his mother. But on the last page, dated 2 days before the fatal mission, there was a scribbled note in the margin. T is locking up on the standard Dutch. Too much static on the radio. Too much brass flying. Switching to the old ranch protocol for the heavy stuff. He remembers the wolf. Weaver stared at the page. The old ranch protocol. He remembers the wolf. Friday morning arrived with the suffocating pressure of a ticking bomb. The tarmac was slick with a marine layer of mist as Weaver loaded Titan into the back of a tactical vehicle. The dog hopped in willingly, but his tail was low, his posture submissive. He knew where they were going. He knew the smell of the tactical gear Weaver was wearing. Master Chief Sullivan was already at the C-17 mock-up, a massive hollowed-out fuselage of a cargo plane used for simulating high-altitude jumps, tactical insertions, and hijacking scenarios. Inside, it was a cavern of steel and dim red tactical lighting. "You ready to put this to bed, Tom?" Sullivan asked, holding a stopwatch. Several other instructors stood on the perimeter, arms crossed. They weren't there to watch a miracle. They were there to witness a merciful execution of a failed career. "We're ready," Weaver said, his voice completely devoid of the anxiety clawing at his stomach. Inside the fuselage, the scenario was set. 3 role players in heavy bite suits were hidden among stacks of cargo pallets. At the push of a button, industrial speakers would pump 110 decibels of recorded battlefield noise, AK-47 fire, screaming, rotor wash into the enclosed metal tube. Strobe lights would simulate muzzle flashes. It was a sensory nightmare. Weaver brought Titan to the designated starting line at the rear ramp. He clipped a heavy carabiner to the dog's tactical vest. "Let's go," Sullivan commanded into his radio. The fuselage erupted. The noise was instantly deafening, bouncing off the steel walls. Strobe lights fractured the darkness, turning the interior into a disorienting, strobing hellscape. Instantly, Titan folded, his knees buckled, and he pressed his belly flat against the cold steel of the ramp. He whined. A high-pitched, terrified sound, completely drowned out by the synthetic gunfire. He clamped his eyes shut. "He's done, Tom," Sullivan yelled over the noise, shaking his head. "End X. No. Give me 10 seconds. Weaver roared back. He dropped to his knees, heedless of the sharp pain in his injured leg. He ignored the flashing lights, the screaming role players, and the blasting audio. He grabbed Titan's head by the sides of his thick, furry neck, forcing the dog to look at him. Titan's amber eyes were wide with blind panic. He wasn't in Coronado anymore. He was back in Helmand. He was smelling the cordite and the copper tang of McNamara's blood. "Titan," Weaver said, keeping his voice incredibly calm, an anchor in the synthetic hurricane. He remembered the journal, the old ranch protocol. He remembers the wolf. Mac had grown up in Montana, running off-leash tracking dogs to hunt coyotes and keep wolves away from the cattle. In that vast, silent wilderness, a loud command was useless. A dog running on pure predatory instinct didn't respond to military Dutch. They responded to the ancestral language of the pack. They responded to the primal trigger. Weaver didn't shout hit. He didn't shout bite. He didn't use English, German, or Dutch. He leaned in so his mouth was less than an inch from Titan's intact right ear. He took a deep breath, dropping his vocal register to a guttural, barely audible vibration in the back of his throat. It was a sound no one else in the roaring plain could possibly hear. Tsika. It was a Slovakian command. But it wasn't a military word. It was an old-world shepherd's whisper. It meant, simply, hunt. The reaction was not gradual. It was an explosion. The panic instantly vanished from Titan's eyes, replaced by a terrifying, cold clarity. The trembling stopped. His ears, pinned flat to his skull a second before, snapped rigidly forward. The massive German shepherd didn't just stand up. He launched himself off the steel deck. Weaver released the carabiner. Titan moved like a black missile through the strobe lights. He bypassed the first stack of pallets entirely, his nose instantly filtering through the smell of aviation fuel and sweat to lock onto the hidden role player. A man in a padded bite suit stepped out from the shadows, raising a simulated weapon. Titan didn't hesitate. He didn't bark. He struck in absolute, lethal silence. The 80-pound dog hit the man's padded chest with the force of a battering ram, launching the 200-pound instructor off his feet and slamming him backward into a cargo net. Titan's jaws locked onto the padded forearm with a sickening thud, his back teeth grinding in a full, punishing grip. "Holy hell!" one of the observing instructors shouted, stepping back in shock. The simulated gunfire kept roaring. The strobes kept flashing. But Titan wasn't cowering. He was dominating. He violently thrashed his head, ripping the role player from side to side, completely utterly unbothered by the chaos around him. He was no longer a traumatized survivor. He was the apex predator McNamara had forged. "Out!" Weaver commanded sharply, stepping up. Titan instantly released the bite, dropping back to a flawless, vibrating sit position, his eyes locked on the downed man, waiting for the next whisper. The audio track abruptly cut off. The strobe lights halted. The sudden silence in the C-17 fuselage was deafening. Master Chief Sullivan walked slowly down the ramp, his eyes wide, staring at the dog as if he had just witnessed a ghost materialize. He looked at the role player, who was groaning and struggling to get up, clearly bruised despite the heavy protective suit. Sullivan looked at Weaver. "What the hell did you just say to him?" Weaver reached down, patting Titan's broad, heaving chest. "I didn't give him an order, Master Chief. I just reminded him who he is." Sullivan stared at the dog for a long moment, then looked down at his stopwatch. He clicked it off, slipping it into his pocket. "Keep him," Sullivan said quietly. "He's yours now." But as Weaver led Titan off the ramp, the dog walking tall and proud at his side, Weaver knew the real battle hadn't even begun. He had unlocked the weapon, but he hadn't yet healed the dog, and with the deployment cycle looming, they were about to be sent straight back into the fire that had broken Titan in the first place. This time, the bullets wouldn't be simulated, and a whispered command wouldn't stop an ambush. The 72-hour deadline had passed, but saving a life is rarely as simple as flipping a switch. Weaver had unlocked the weapon, but the mind of the animal wielding it was still a fractured landscape of trauma. The brass, primarily Master Chief Sullivan, had signed off on Titan's reinstatement with a heavy caveat. Titan was on a zero-tolerance probation. One hesitation, one misstep in a live-fire scenario, and the dog would be pulled from the roster forever. To complicate matters, Weaver and Titan were attached to a specialized assault element from SEAL Team 4, led by Lieutenant Commander John Wyatt. Wyatt was a pragmatic, battle-hardened officer who viewed his men and his assets through a lens of absolute, chilling calculus. He didn't care about a dog's tragic backstory. He cared about lethality and reliability. "I saw the C-17 footage, Weaver," Wyatt said, leaning against the briefing room table, his arms crossed over his chest. The rest of the squad, Sniper Petty Officer First Class Coop Cooper, Breacher Chief Petty Officer Henderson, and Medic Petty Officer Doc Gallagher sat in silence, assessing the new handler and his volatile dog. It was a neat party trick, but out there, in the dirt, party tricks get my guys killed. I knew McNamara. Mac was a cowboy. You're trying to ride his broken horse into a kinetic strike zone. Give me one good reason I shouldn't request a standard green MPC. Straight out of basic, Weaver, sitting with Titan resting calmly at his feet, met Wyatt's gaze. "Because a green dog hasn't been through the fire, Commander. A green dog doesn't know what it costs. Titan does. He's not broken anymore. He's calibrated. You want a dog that runs on blind obedience, get a rookie. You want a dog that can think through an ambush. You take him." Wyatt stared at the massive black shepherd. Titan stared back, unblinking, his amber eyes reflecting the cold fluorescent lights. 6 weeks to deployment, Wyatt finally said, his voice a low gravel. "If he flinches during workups, I'm cutting you both loose." For the next 42 days, Weaver didn't just train. He bled for the dog. He understood that relying solely on the whispered Sika was dangerous. In a chaotic firefight, if Weaver was pinned down or out of breath, the command would be useless. He had to bridge the gap between Titan's primal, predatory state and the standard operational demands of a SEAL platoon. The process was agonizing. Weaver started by taking Titan into the shoot house, a live-fire facility constructed of ballistic rubber. He didn't fire a weapon at first. He simply walked Titan through the rooms, letting the dog smell the gunpowder and the spent brass. Whenever Titan's ears pinned back the first physical indicator of a panic loop, Weaver would stop, drop to a knee, and issue the low, vibrating chica to snap the dog out of the flashback, instantly rewarding him with a high-value tug toy. Slowly, methodically, Weaver reintroduced the noise. First, suppressed pistol fire from 50 yards away. Then, unsuppressed M4 carbines. Finally, flashbangs and breaching charges. It wasn't a linear progression. There were nights when Titan would wake up in the kennels, violently thrashing against the chain link, trapped in a night terror of the Helmand province. On those nights, Weaver didn't sleep. He sat on the cold concrete floor, letting the 80-pound dog bury his massive head into his lap, stroking the dark fur until the shaking stopped. Weaver didn't speak to him like a machine. He spoke to him like a brother who had survived the same war. "I know, buddy." Weaver would murmur in the dark, his hand resting over the scar tissue of Titan's ruptured eardrum. "I know the ghosts are loud. We just have to be louder." By the fourth week, a subtle but profound shift occurred. Titan stopped looking for the ghosts and started looking at Weaver. The bond between a handler and an NPC is usually built on respect and repetition. The bond between Weaver and Titan was forged in mutual salvation. Titan began to mirror Weaver's quiet, intense energy. He learned the subtle physical cues of the men in the squad. He learned that when Coop adjusted his sniper veil, it meant they were going dark. He learned that when Henderson reached for his breaching tools, a concussive shockwave was imminent. During the final full mission profile, FMP, exercise a simulated night raid in the California desert, Titan performed flawlessly. He tracked a simulated fleeing hostile through 2 miles of scrub brush, ignoring the heavy machine gun fire pumping from the training cadre's blank-firing adapters. When the hostile barricaded himself in a concrete bunker, Titan didn't hesitate. At Weaver's standard, loud command of hit, the dog launched through the doorway, bypassing the noise, and neutralized the target in seconds. Wyatt watched the takedown through his night vision goggles. When Weaver and Titan emerged from the bunker, the dog perfectly at heel, Wyatt keyed his radio. "Command. This is Voodoo 1. Asset is green across the board. We are mission ready." 2 weeks later, the deployment orders came down, and the temperature in the room plummeted. The briefing room at the forward operating base in Djibouti, Africa, was stiflingly hot, smelling of ozone from the projector and stale sweat. Captain Sarah Mitchell, the lead intelligence officer, stood at the front, illuminating a satellite image of a sprawling, heavily fortified compound nestled in a rocky valley across the Gulf of Aden, deep within Yemen. "Target is Al-Qasim," Mitchell stated, tapping a laser pointer against the screen. "He's a high-level facilitator moving Iranian-supplied explosively formed penetrators, EFPs, into the region. Intel puts him in this primary structure. He moves with a security detail of roughly 20 to 30 heavily armed fighters. The perimeter is monitored by roving patrols and, we suspect, early warning tripwires." Weaver stared at the satellite imagery. The topography, steep, unforgiving rock faces leading down into a bowl-shaped valley, was a tactical nightmare. It was a fatal funnel. It looked terrifyingly similar to the terrain where McNamara had been killed. "Insertion will be via MH-47S, offset by 5 kilometers to avoid auditory compromise," Wyatt continued, taking over the briefing. "We ruck in under zero illumination, breach the compound, secure Al-Qasim, and exfil before the local militia can mobilize. Weaver, your dog is on point for the approach. We need to know about tripwires or IEDs before we step on them." "Copy that," Weaver said, feeling the familiar, icy knot of pre-mission adrenaline tightening in his gut. He looked down at Titan. The dog was lying quietly, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes were wide open, tracking the movement in the room. The ghost of McNamara hung heavily in the air. Titan was going back into the fire. And this time, there was no safety net. The rotor wash of the MH-47 Chinook was a deafening roar that vibrated through the marrow of the bone. Inside the blacked-out cabin, bathed in the eerie green glow of night vision optics, the men of Voodoo Element sat in stoic silence. Weaver sat near the tail ramp, his hand resting firmly on Titan's tactical harness. The dog was wearing his own combat gear. A customized Kevlar vest, protective ear muffs, mutt muffs, to dampen the extreme noise of the rotors, and infrared strobes on his back for aerial identification. Titan's posture was rigid. He wasn't shaking, but the tension radiating off his muscular frame felt like a coiled spring. 2 minutes! The crew chief yelled, holding up 2 fingers. Weaver leaned down, pulling the protective ear gear off Titan's head so the dog could work. He pressed his forehead against Titan's snout. "Stay with me," Weaver whispered over the noise. Titan offered a single, quick lick to Weaver's jaw, a rare display of affection from the stoic animal. The heavy ramp descended, revealing a swirling vortex of brown dust and the pitch-black void of the Yemeni desert. The ramp hit the rocky ground, and Wyatt's voice crackled in their earpieces. "Go, go, go." They flowed out of the helicopter like water, a silent line of shadows disappearing into the jagged rocks. The temperature was pushing 90 degrees even at midnight, the air thick and choking. Weaver immediately unclipped Titan's short lead, transitioning him to a long tracking line. "Seek," Weaver commanded softly. Titan dropped his nose to the ground, his ears pivoting like radar dishes. The dog instantly transitioned from a passenger to the tip of the spear. The 5-kilometer trek was grueling. The terrain was a chaotic jumble of shale and boulders that threatened to snap ankles with every step. But Titan moved with an ethereal grace, picking his way through the rocks, his nose analyzing thousands of scent particles every second. 2 kilometers from the compound, Titan suddenly stopped. His body locked into a rigid, statue-like point. He didn't bark. He simply looked back at Weaver and sat down heavily. Weaver threw a closed fist into the air. The entire patrol halted instantly, melting into the shadows. Weaver moved forward, crouching low. "What do you have, buddy?" he breathed. Titan bumped his nose toward a narrow gap between 2 large boulders, the only natural path forward. Weaver pulled his night vision goggles down and scanned the gap. Nothing. He activated a low-power infrared flashlight. A thin, nearly invisible monofilament line stretched across the rocks at shin height, attached to a cluster of Soviet-era artillery shells rigged with a blasting cap. "A tripwire. IED," Weaver whispered into his comms. "Dog caught it. We need to reroute. Good boy." Wyatt's voice replied, tight with relief. "Shift 50 meters east. Keep moving." Titan had just saved 12 lives, but the night was far from over. They reached the objective at 0300. The compound was exactly as intelligence had described, a mud brick fortress surrounded by a high wall, nestled against the side of a steep hill. 2 armed sentries paced the roof, smoking cigarettes, their AK-47s slung lazily over their shoulders. "Coop, take the watchers," Wyatt ordered. "On it," the sniper replied softly. "Pft, pft." The suppressed, subsonic rounds from the sniper rifle were barely a whisper, but the 2 sentries crumpled instantly, disappearing from the roofline. "Henderson, breach the gate. Weaver, you and Titan are first through the fatal funnel. Let's go," Wyatt commanded. They stacked up on the heavy wooden gate. Henderson expertly placed a strip of det cord along the hinges. Weaver tightened his grip on his rifle and looked down at Titan. The dog was hyper-focused, his muscles twitching with suppressed energy. "Breaching," Henderson muttered. The explosion shattered the silence of the valley. It wasn't the sterile pop of the training house. It was a violent, earth-shaking detonation that blew the wooden gate inward with a shower of lethal splinters and blinding dust. Instantly, the compound erupted. The element of surprise was gone. Automatic weapons fire poured from the upper windows of the primary structure, chewing up the mud brick walls around the seals. Tracers lit up the night sky like deadly green fireflies. The noise was apocalyptic. The deafening chatter of PKM machine guns, the screams of the fighters, the cracking of supersonic rounds overhead. "Move! Push in!" Wyatt roared over the gunfire. Weaver stepped through the smoking threshold, raising his rifle. Titan was at his left knee. Through the swirling dust, a fighter emerged from a side doorway in the courtyard, raising an RPG-7 directly at the stacked element. It was a nightmare scenario. There was no time to aim, no time to shoot. Titan saw the threat before Weaver could pull the trigger. The dog didn't wait for a command. He didn't freeze. The training, the rehabilitation, and the primal instincts fused into one explosive action. Titan launched himself across the courtyard. He closed the 20-foot gap in a heartbeat, a black streak of vengeance. The fighter panicked, attempting to track the dog, but Titan hit him high in the chest. The 80-pound shepherd struck with the force of a wrecking ball, knocking the man violently backward. The RPG discharged, firing wildly into the night sky, detonating harmlessly against the cliff face above them. Titan locked his jaws onto the man's weapon arm, shaking violently, neutralizing the threat with terrifying efficiency. "Clear right," Weaver shouted, dropping another fighter who rushed out of the main building. The courtyard was secured in 30 seconds of blistering violence. Titan held his grip on the downed RPG gunner until Weaver tapped his shoulder. Out. Titan released instantly, returning to Weaver's side, panting heavily but utterly composed. The fear that had paralyzed him months ago was gone. He was in his element. "Push inside. Find Al-Qasim," Wyatt ordered, moving toward the main entrance. They breached the main house. Room by room, the SEALs cleared the ground floor in a brutal, methodical dance of flashbangs and short, controlled bursts of rifle fire. Titan cleared the blind corners, his mere presence terrifying the remaining fighters into surrender. They hit the second floor. Weaver and Titan stacked behind Wyatt on a heavy metal door at the end of the hallway. This was the presumed location of the HVT. "Ready," Wyatt signaled. Henderson kicked the door open. Inside the dimly lit room, Al-Qasim was backed against the wall. He wasn't reaching for a rifle. He was holding a dead man's switch. A thick wire ran from his hand directly to a massive suicide vest strapped around the chest of a young, terrified-looking teenager, standing forcefully in front of him, a human shield. "Hold fire! Hold fire!" Wyatt screamed. If they shot Al-Qasim, his hand would release the switch, and the vest would level the entire floor, killing everyone in the room. Al-Qasim sneered, speaking rapidly in Arabic, his thumb trembling on the detonator. The standoff was absolute. A sniper shot was impossible due to the angle and the human shield. A rush would be too slow. "We need to neutralize his arm without killing him," Wyatt hissed over the comms, his rifle trained on the man's face. "If that thumb slips, we're all red mist." Weaver looked at the distance. It was 15 feet, a small gap between a heavy oak desk and a couch. A man couldn't move fast enough, but a dog could. The problem was the noise. Al-Qasim was screaming. The SEALs were shouting commands in Arabic. The gunfire outside was still echoing. If Weaver yelled "hit," the sudden auditory spike might trigger Al-Qasim to flinch and drop the switch. Weaver needed absolute, silent precision. He dropped to one knee, lowering his weapon slightly to clear a path. He reached out, resting 2 fingers against the side of Titan's neck. The dog was already locked onto Al-Qasim, sensing the immense threat radiating from the man. Weaver took a breath, letting the chaos of the room wash over him, finding the dead center of the storm. He leaned his mouth against Titan's ear. He didn't use the standard command. He didn't shout. Deep in his throat, carrying the weight of a ghost from Montana and the trust of a man from Coronado, Weaver whispered the word, "Tika." The human eye takes approximately 300 milliseconds to blink. Titan crossed the 15 feet of blood-slicked stone floor in less than half that time. He didn't leap through the air in a sweeping, cinematic arc that would have given Al-Qasim a target to track. Instead, the German shepherd stayed terrifyingly low to the ground, his claws scrabbling for traction, launching his 80-pound frame like a torpedo beneath the line of sight. Al-Qasim never saw the dog coming. His eyes were locked in a death stare with Lieutenant Commander Wyatt. The only warning the terrorist had was a sudden blur of black fur darting past the terrified teenager's legs. Titan struck not with his teeth first, but with the full, concussive momentum of his broad chest. He collided directly with Al-Qasim's knees, buckling the man's legs and sending him crashing backward against the mud brick wall. As Al-Qasim fell, his right arm reflexively jerked upward to catch his balance, the arm holding the dead man's switch. In a fraction of a second, Titan's jaws snapped shut. He didn't target the bicep or the forearm. Instinct and Weaver's countless hours of hyper-specific targeting drills took over. Titan clamped his massive jaws entirely over Al-Qasim's right hand, engulfing the detonator, the thumb, and the plastic switch in one punishing, unyielding cage of bone and canine teeth. Al-Qasim screamed, a high-pitched wail of agony, but his thumb never lifted. The sheer crushing pressure of a German shepherd's bite exceeding 230 pounds per square inch paralyzed the extensors in the man's forearm and forced the plastic switch to remain securely depressed inside the dog's mouth. "Hold him!" Wyatt roared. Surging forward, the room erupted into controlled motion. The teenager wearing the suicide vest dropped to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Henderson grabbed the boy by the collar, dragging him backward out of the immediate blast radius, while Doc Gallagher swiftly produced a pair of trauma shears, ready to cut the wires. Weaver sprinted to Titan's side. The dog was vibrating with adrenaline. His amber eyes locked onto Weaver, waiting for the next cue. Blood was seeping from Al-Qasim's hand down Titan's jaw, but the dog didn't adjust his grip. If he shifted even a millimeter, the switch could pop. Wyatt dropped to his knees next to the terrorist, pulling a roll of heavy tactical tape from his chest rig. He wrapped his own gloved hand firmly over Titan's muzzle, gripping the switch assembly and Al-Qasim's shattered fingers. "I have the switch," Wyatt commanded, his voice tight. "Weaver, get him off." "Out," Weaver said sharply. Titan instantly disengaged, sliding backward on his haunches, his jaw releasing the bloody mass into Wyatt's waiting grip. Wyatt smoothly transitioned the tape, binding the dead man's switch permanently in the depressed position before cutting the wire connected to the vest. "Vest is cold. HVT is secure," Wyatt shouted, exhaling a breath that sounded like a steam valve releasing. He looked up at Weaver, his eyes wide. "Good dog. We're not done yet," Weaver grimaced, clipping the tactical lead back onto Titan's harness. Outside, the tenor of the gunfire had abruptly shifted. The disorganized, sporadic popping of AK-47s had been replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thud of a DSK heavy machine gun tearing through the compound's exterior walls. The local militia's Quick Reaction Force, QRF, had arrived. "Voodoo 1, this is Overwatch." Coop's voice crackled frantically over the radio from his sniper position on a nearby ridge. "You have multiple technicals pickup trucks with heavy guns pushing into the valley from the north. Estimate 40-plus hostile fighters converging on your position. You need to exfil, yesterday." "Copy that, Coop. Pack it up and head to the HLZ," Wyatt ordered, hauling a bleeding and zip-tied Al-Qasim to his feet. "Henderson, take point. Weaver, you and Titan cover the rear. We are fighting our way out." They moved down the narrow staircase in a tight diamond formation. The air inside the compound was thick with pulverized concrete and smoke. The moment they stepped into the open courtyard, the sky tore open. A deafening whistle pierced the chaos, followed instantly by a catastrophic explosion. An RPG had struck the roof of the adjacent armory building. The shockwave lifted Weaver off his feet, throwing him violently through the air. He hit the stone floor hard, the wind knocked from his lungs, his vision instantly whited out by a cloud of suffocating dust. Above him, the heavy wooden beams of the armory's awning groaned, splintered, and collapsed. Weaver barely had time to raise his arms before a section of the masonry crashed down, pinning his lower legs beneath hundreds of pounds of debris. A sickening pop echoed in his already shattered right knee, followed by a wave of blinding pain that made him scream. "Weaver's down," Doc Gallagher shouted through the swirling dust. But Doc was immediately pinned behind a stone pillar as the DSK machine gun mounted on a truck outside the gates began chewing through the courtyard, sending lethal shards of rock flying in every direction. The SEALs were trapped in a crossfire. Weaver coughed violently, tasting blood and dirt. He tried to pull his leg free, but the masonry wouldn't budge. Panic, cold and sharp, began to creep into the edges of his mind. Then, he felt a wet nose press against his cheek. Titan was there. The dog was covered in gray dust, his black coat barely visible, but he was uninjured. However, Weaver noticed something terrifying. Titan's ears were pinned flat against his skull. The dog was trembling violently, his eyes darting frantically around the smoke-filled courtyard. The concussive blast, the smell of cordite, the raining debris, it was a perfect, hellish replica of the explosion in Helmand that had killed McNamara. Titan whined, a high, desperate sound, and pressed his body over Weaver's chest, trying to shield him. He was guarding the body. He was slipping back into the trauma loop. He thought his handler was dead again. "No, buddy, no," Weaver choked out, reaching up with a trembling hand to grab the dog's heavy leather collar. "I'm right here. Look at me." But the machine gun fire roared, drowning out his voice. Titan's eyes rolled back in pure panic. He was checking out. The ghost in the machine was taking over. The courtyard was a meat grinder. Bullet strikes sparked violently against the stones, sending lethal fragments of shrapnel zipping through the air. Wyatt, Henderson, and Doc were laying down overwhelming suppressive fire, but they were vastly outnumbered. Weaver knew if Titan shut down completely, neither of them was making it out of the courtyard. The dog was too heavy to carry, and Weaver couldn't even stand. "Titan," Weaver yelled, coughing up a lungful of dust. He needed to break the cycle. He needed to reach past the noise and touch the dog's soul. He didn't use the combat whisper. That was for the hunt. Right now, he needed the pack. Weaver grabbed Titan's head, ignoring the gunfire, and pulled the dog's face inches from his own. He pressed his forehead against Titan's dusty snout, just as he had done in the helicopter. "I am not Mac," Weaver screamed over the din, pouring every ounce of command and love into his voice. "I am not leaving you. Dig. Damn it. Dig." He shoved the dog's shoulder, pointing at the massive block of masonry pinning his legs. For an agonizing second, Titan froze. The conflict in the animal's mind was almost physically visible, the instinct to cower and guard warring against the command of his current handler. Then, the amber eyes snapped into focus. The trembling stopped. Titan didn't whine. He turned toward the rubble, clamped his teeth onto a thick wooden support beam protruding from the masonry, and braced his powerful hind legs. He pulled with a guttural growl, 80 pounds of pure muscle fighting against the dead weight of the collapsed roof. "Doc, move," Wyatt barked, providing covering fire. Doc Gallagher broke from his cover, sliding on his knees through the dirt until he reached Weaver. Seeing the dog struggling to move the beam, Doc wedged his own hands under the masonry. "On 3, Doc yelled. 1, 2, 3. Heave. Together." The combat medic and the multi-purpose canine leveraged the debris just high enough. Weaver gritted his teeth, digging his elbows into the dirt, and dragged his shattered legs backward. He was free, but the moment he tried to put weight on his right knee, his leg folded beneath him like wet paper. "Can't walk," Weaver grunted, leaning heavily against the courtyard wall. "You don't have to," Doc said, throwing Weaver's right arm over his shoulder. Wyatt dropped back, taking Weaver's left side. "Henderson, blow the back wall. We're taking the wadi," Wyatt commanded, adjusting his grip on the zip-tied Al-Qasim. Henderson slapped a hasty C4 charge against the weakened rear wall of the compound, blowing a jagged hole into the darkness of the rocky valley behind the structure. They funneled through the breach, leaving the burning compound and the main bulk of the militia behind them. But the desert offered no sanctuary. The wadi, a dry riverbed carving through the valley, was pitch black, littered with uneven boulders and twisting unpredictably. Above them, the militia had begun fanning out along the ridge, firing blindly down into the darkness. "We're flying blind here, boss," Henderson panted, taking point. "Night vision is washed out from the fires, and we can't use white light without giving away our position." They were stumbling. With Wyatt and Doc carrying Weaver, the element's firepower was cut in half, and their speed was reduced to a crawl. They needed a navigator who didn't rely on optics. Weaver looked down. Titan was walking closely at his side, his nose testing the air. "Unclip him," Weaver breathed through the pain. "What?" Wyatt asked, incredulous. "If he bolts in the dark, we lose him. He won't bolt. Unclip him. Let him hunt." Doc reached down and popped the carabiner off Titan's harness. Weaver gave a short, double click with his tongue. "Seek," Weaver commanded softly. "Find the path." Freed from the leash, Titan vanished into the ink-black wadi ahead of them. For 5 agonizing minutes, they dragged themselves forward through the dark, guided only by the occasional infrared strobe flashing on the dog's back 50 yards ahead. Titan had become their eyes and ears. He weaved through the boulders, mapping the safest route through the treacherous terrain. Suddenly, the infrared strobe stopped moving. Weaver tapped Wyatt's shoulder. "Hold." The squad froze. Up ahead, in the blackness, a low, menacing growl echoed off the canyon walls. It was followed by a sharp yelp and the clatter of a rifle hitting the rocks. "Flankers," Wyatt whispered. 2 militia fighters had descended into the wadi to cut them off. Titan had found them first. A suppressed shot echoed from the ridge above them. "Pfft. Got the second one." Coop's voice chimed perfectly over the radio. The sniper was tracking their movement from above. "Your dog just took down the first guy, Commander. Path is clear. HLZ is 400 meters south. Keep moving," Wyatt grunted, hoisting Weaver higher. The roar of the incoming MH-47 Chinook was the sweetest sound Weaver had ever heard. The massive helicopter flared out over the desert floor, its rotors kicking up a blinding sandstorm. The rear ramp was already down, heavily armed crew chiefs scanning the darkness with their weapons. They dragged themselves up the steel ramp, collapsing onto the metal floor. Doc immediately began working on Weaver's leg, injecting a blessed dose of morphine into his thigh. Henderson tossed Al-Qasim onto the deck, binding his legs. "We're clear. Get us out of here," Wyatt yelled into his headset. The Chinook lifted off heavily, banking hard over the mountains and leaving the burning valley of Yemen far below. The interior of the helicopter was freezing, the adrenaline crashing out of the men's systems. Weaver lay flat on his back, staring up at the hydraulic lines running along the ceiling, his chest heaving. The pain in his leg was a dull, thumping agony, but he was alive. He felt a heavy weight settle onto his chest. Titan had climbed over the tactical gear and sprawled his 80-pound body directly on top of Weaver. The dog rested his massive, blood-stained head beneath Weaver's chin. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't panting. He simply closed his amber eyes and let out a long, exhausted sigh. Wyatt unclipped his helmet, leaning back against the fuselage. He looked at the dog, then at Weaver, the pragmatic calculus in his eyes entirely replaced by profound respect. "I'll be damned," Wyatt said quietly over the drone of the rotors. "You were right, Tom. The broken ones fight the hardest." Weaver smiled weakly, wrapping his arms around the black shepherd. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The ghosts were finally gone, left behind in the dust and the dark. The transition from the deafening roar of a combat exfiltration to the sterile, suffocating silence of a military hospital is a violent shock to the soul. When Chief Petty Officer Thomas Weaver finally opened his eyes, the desert of Yemen was gone, replaced by the blinding white, fluorescent lights of Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. The rhythmic beep of a heart monitor substituted the chatter of machine gun fire. He tried to shift his weight, but a blinding flare of agony shot up from his right leg, instantly stealing his breath. He looked down. His leg was heavily immobilized in a steel halo, pinned together by external fixators. "Don't move, Chief," a soft voice cautioned. Doc Gallagher stepped into his field of vision, looking exhausted, dark circles bruised beneath his eyes. "You've been under for 2 days. The orthopedic surgeons had to rebuild your knee almost entirely from titanium and cadaver bone. You're lucky they didn't amputate." Weaver let his head fall back against the starchy pillow, his throat raw from the intubation tube that had recently been removed. His mind frantically pieced together the fragmented memories of the wadi, the darkness, and the heavy weight pressing against his chest on the flight out. "Where is he?" Weaver rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Where's Titan?" Doc Gallagher sighed, pulling up a plastic chair and sitting down heavily. "He's physically fine, Tom. Not a scratch on him. But he's not here. Command flew him back to Coronado on a C-17 yesterday. He's back in the kennels." A cold spike of dread pierced through the narcotic haze clouding Weaver's brain. "Why didn't they keep him with me?" "Because of the after-action report," a new voice answered from the doorway. Lieutenant Commander John Wyatt walked into the room, dressed in clean utilities, holding a manila folder. He looked grim. Wyatt dismissed Doc Gallagher with a subtle nod, and the medic slipped out into the hallway, closing the door behind him. Wyatt stood at the foot of Weaver's bed. The raid was a massive operational success, Tom. Al-Qasim is currently singing like a bird in a black site, and we secured a massive cache of intelligence on Iranian EFP routes. But the highlight of the debrief wasn't the breach. It was the dog. Weaver closed his eyes. He knew exactly what was coming. The brass read the report on how Titan neutralized a suicide bomber with a dead man's switch. Wyatt continued, his tone purely analytical. They read how he cleared a minefield in zero visibility. Suddenly, the dog everyone wanted to euthanize 6 weeks ago is the most valuable multi-purpose canine in naval special warfare. Captain Reynolds from the K9 Directorate is calling him a miracle of rehabilitation. He's not a miracle, John, Weaver said, struggling to push himself up on his elbows. He's a survivor, clinging to a very fragile lifeline. You saw him in the courtyard when the roof came down. He almost reverted. He almost locked up. The only thing keeping him in the fight is me. I know that, Wyatt said quietly. But Captain Reynolds doesn't. And here is the brutal reality, Tom. Your knee is destroyed. The surgeons have already submitted the paperwork. You are medically grounded. You will never deploy as a kinetic operator again. You're being transitioned to a medical discharge. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Weaver had given 14 years of his life to the teams. He had sacrificed his body, his peace of mind, and nearly his life. But losing his career wasn't what terrified him in that moment. They want to reassign Titan. Weaver realized, the horror creeping into his voice. Wyatt nodded slowly. Reynolds has already paired him with a new handler. Petty Officer, First Class Hayes. Good kid, strong resume. They're spinning Titan up for a deployment to Syria in 3 weeks. No, Weaver snarled, ignoring the pain radiating from his leg as he threw the bedsheets off. No, you can't let them do that. If they put him back into a hot zone with a handler who doesn't understand the triggers, he won't just fail. He'll get himself and his entire team killed. He'll snap. You have to tell them. I did tell them, Tom, Wyatt said, stepping forward and placing a firm hand on Weaver's shoulder to keep him from moving. I pushed back as hard as I could. I told Reynolds the dog is fiercely handler-dependent. But Reynolds looks at the spreadsheet. He sees a $100,000 asset, operating at peak lethality. The Navy isn't going to retire a Tier 1 K9 just because his handler caught a bad break. Weaver stared at Wyatt, his chest heaving. The military was a machine. It didn't possess a heart. It possessed a budget and operational requirements. Titan had proven he could be a weapon, and the machine was hungry for weapons. Get me back to Coronado, Weaver demanded, his eyes burning with a fierce, desperate light. I don't care if you have to strap me to a cargo pallet. Get me back to my dog. 3 weeks later, the California sun beat down relentlessly on the Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. Chief Petty Officer Thomas Weaver stood leaning heavily on a pair of aluminum crutches outside the chain-link fence of the primary K9 training yard. He was pale, thinner, and heavily medicated, but his eyes were locked on the scene unfolding in the dirt. Captain Reynolds, a stiff-backed officer who looked like he had spent more time in the Pentagon than in the dirt, stood with a clipboard. Next to him was Master Chief Sullivan. In the center of the yard was Titan. Handling him was Petty Officer Hayes, a young muscular SEAL who was visibly sweating. They were running a simulated urban patrol. Industrial speakers were blasting the sounds of a riot, screaming crowds, breaking glass, and sporadic gunfire. Push him, Hayes. Send him. Reynolds barked over the noise. Hit! Hayes screamed, pointing at a role player in a bite suit, who had just emerged from behind a simulated burned-out vehicle, firing blanks from an AK-47. Titan didn't move. The massive black German Shepherd stood frozen next to Hayes. His tail was tucked so tightly it touched his stomach. His ears were pinned flat against his skull. He was trembling violently, his amber eyes wide with a familiar, terrifying panic. He wasn't looking at the target. He was looking desperately around the yard, searching for a ghost. Hit! Damn it, Titan, hit! Hayes yelled, yanking aggressively on the tactical lead. The aggressive yank was the final straw. Titan panicked. He dropped his belly to the dirt and began to thrash, trying to back out of his harness, whining in a pitch that broke Weaver's heart. "End X! Cut the audio!" Reynolds yelled, throwing his hands up in frustration. The synthetic noise abruptly died. Reynolds turned to Sullivan. "What the hell is going on, Master Chief?" The after-action report from Yemen said this dog was a predator. "He looks like a beaten stray." "He told you, sir," Sullivan said quietly, gesturing toward the fence. Reynolds turned and saw Weaver standing there, leaning on his crutches. Weaver limped slowly through the gate, dragging his casted leg through the sand. Hayes, looking embarrassed and defeated, stepped back as Weaver approached. Weaver didn't look at the officers. He looked at Titan. The dog was still cowering in the dirt. Panting heavily, Weaver awkwardly lowered himself, letting his crutches fall to the ground, and sat in the sand. He ignored the shooting pain in his knee. "Titan," Weaver said softly. The dog's head snapped up. The transformation was instantaneous. The trembling stopped. Titan scrambled forward, his tail wagging furiously, and buried his massive head into Weaver's chest, licking his face with frantic, desperate joy. Weaver wrapped his arms around the thick neck, burying his face in the dark fur, closing his eyes against the sting of tears. "Captain," Commander Wyatt's voice rang out as he strode into the training yard, holding a thick file. "I believe you've seen enough to confirm my assessment." Reynolds frowned. "The dog is a psychological wreck, Commander. He's completely regressed." "No, sir. He hasn't regressed. He is simply unbroken," Wyatt countered smoothly, handing the file to Reynolds. "Titan operates under a highly specific, unorthodox command structure that only Chief Weaver possesses. When placed under kinetic stress with any standard handler, the dog suffers from catastrophic PTSD loops. He is exclusively effective under Weaver's command." Reynolds looked at the file, then down at the dog currently curled securely in Weaver's lap. "Weaver is medically discharged. He can't handle a dog in the field." "Exactly," Wyatt said, a sharp, triumphant edge to his voice. "Which makes Titan officially undeployable. According to DoD Regulation 702-4 regarding military working dogs, an asset deemed permanently undeployable due to psychological trauma resulting from combat action must be evaluated for medical retirement, and as his commanding officer, I have already signed the evaluation." Reynolds scowled, realizing he had been outmaneuvered by the tactical commander. "You're retiring a $100,000 asset?" "I'm retiring a veteran who has shed blood for this country, Captain," Wyatt said coldly, "and under the Robbie law, the dog's handler gets first rights of adoption." Wyatt looked down at Weaver, offering a rare, genuine smile. "Take your dog home, Tom." 2 years later, the biting wind of a Montana winter howled through the towering pines of the Bitterroot Valley. Snow fell in thick, silent sheets, blanketing the isolated cabin and the surrounding acres of wilderness in pure white. Thomas Weaver stood on the back porch, wearing a heavy flannel jacket, leaning comfortably on a sleek carbon fiber cane. He inhaled the sharp, pine-scented air, watching the tree line. A flash of black movement caught his eye. Titan bounded through the deep snow, his massive chest plowing through the drifts with effortless power. There was no tactical vest, no Kevlar, no infrared strobes. He wore a simple leather collar with a brass tag. The graying fur around his muzzle was the only sign of the years that had passed. Titan stopped near a cluster of birch trees, his ears swiveling, his nose buried deep in a rabbit track. He looked back at the porch, locking eyes with Weaver, waiting. Weaver smiled. He thought of McNamara, the quiet cowboy who had grown up in these very mountains, the man who had forged the weapon and left behind the failsafe. He thought of the fire of Yemen and the cold steel of the C-17. All of it felt like a lifetime ago. Weaver raised his hand, cupping it around his mouth. He didn't use English. He didn't use Dutch. He took a breath, letting the sound carry over the howling Montana wind, not as a command of war, but as a release of freedom. Chica. Titan turned and vanished into the wild white trees. Finally, completely, just a dog. If this incredible story of Chief Weaver and Titan's unbreakable bond moved you, hit that like button right now. It helps us bring more untold, gritty stories of heroism, survival, and the profound connection between human and K9 warriors straight to your feed. The military working dogs of naval special warfare sacrifice everything for our freedom. And their stories deserve to be heard. Do you think you could have handled the pressure of the Yemen raid? Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. Don't forget to share this video with a dog lover or a military supporter in your life. And if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another heart-pounding true story. Until next time, stay safe and stay loyal.